Right, let's get started. All right, test results have been posted. A couple people come to me and they say, how can I do better on the final than I did on the midterm? And here's how. Go to Lisa's office hours and go over your results to the midterm. But why, since it's not a cumulative final? Well, here's why. Because if you got more questions wrong than you expected, you want to know, why did I get them wrong? If you look at what the right answer was for the question you got wrong, there's two possible responses. You can look at the right answer and say, oh, yeah, that's the right answer. Why didn't I get that right on the exam? And then you know you have to take the exam differently. Or you can say, oh, I didn't know that, in which case you got to study differently. So you want to know which one it is, and the only way to find that out is to go and go to Lisa's office hours and look over your score in the midterm. Papers are due. People have been coming to me saying, hey, what do you think of this as a topic? And every single time I've said it was a great topic. Again, we're casting a broad net on paper topics. If it's vaguely related, it's good, probably. All right, on to substance. We talked on Wednesday about conflict in intimate relationships. And one of the points we made is that conflict in intimate relationships is inevitable. If you are interdependent with somebody, you are going to have conflict with them. Inevitable. It has to happen. It's a function of interdependence. Today we're going to talk about violence between intimate partners, something called intimate partner violence, or IPV. IPV is not inevitable. IPV does not follow naturally from interdependence. There's nothing about interdependence that demands that we see or witness violence between people who love each other. Nothing inevitable about that at all. It's not inevitable, but what it is distressingly prevalent. Let's start with some facts. 1 to 4 million women are assaulted by a male partner every year, and that's in the United States only. Now you might say, hey, Dr. Carney, 1 to 4 million, that's a big range. You can't settle on a number in there? No, you can't. And why not? Because this is not an event that is reported very accurately or widely. So these are estimates based on the best available data, and the best available data is often not very good, because even when an assault is reported and the cops come and say, okay, we heard that you were in trouble here, sometimes then couples will say, oh, sorry, nothing, that's just a mistake, please go away. So our estimates are rough. Still, that's a lot of people to be physically assaulted by their partners. Boyfriends, husbands, roommates. Now, here's another statistic. In general, women are less likely than men to be victims of a crime. Okay, they're less likely than men to be shot in a gangland killing, to be in a bar fight, to be a victim of a lot of different crimes. But when the crime is relationship violence, women are 5 to 8 times more likely than men to be victims. That's not going to be a surprise to you. But it's just such a huge difference. Again, violence by an intimate partner accounts for 21% of all violence against women. Only 2% of violence against men. So this problem of intimate partner violence is not a problem that impacts men and women to the same degree. What we're talking about is something that is hurting and killing women a lot more than it's hurting and killing men. Men, only 2% of all violence against men is committed by their partner. So if you're a man and you're in a relationship, and unless you're a nervous guy, you're thinking, I wonder where violence in my life is going to come from, chances are it's not going to come from your partner. If you're a woman, you cannot say that with the same certainty. And finally, according to the United States Department of Justice, 33%, that's 1 out of 3. 1/3 of all women who are murdered, 1/3 of all murders against women are committed by that woman's intimate partner. 1 out of 3. That's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. And if we started Wednesday's lecture by talking about how puzzling and mysterious it is that people who love each other sometimes have knockdown, drag-out arguments. If it's puzzling to us that people who love each other should sometimes call each other bad names or raise their voices in anger, how much more puzzling, how much more disturbing, how much more unfathomable is it that sometimes people who claim to love each other should physically strike each other, should physically harm each other, should occasionally kill each other? Well, that's the mystery. And it's a disturbing mystery. And to begin to unravel it, and I don't think in the 70 minutes that we have that I can do justice to fully unraveling it, but to make a stab at it, to give you some framework for understanding this most puzzling and distressing phenomenon, we must first clear up a few myths. Because there's a lot of misinformation about this phenomenon of intimate partner violence. And if I do nothing else today, the goal of this lecture is to clarify so that you can go out and say, well, at least I know what the facts are. So let's clear up a few myths. And one of the myths, obviously, we've just cleared up, which is the idea that intimate partner violence, IPV stands for intimate partner violence, is rare. Now, until the last couple decades, that was the assumption. And that was the assumption behind the fact that intimate partner violence wasn't discussed a lot. It wasn't discussed as a major issue because people thought, well, it doesn't happen very much. It doesn't require a lot of social policy or government intervention or money because it's got to be rare. Only a psychopath, only a drooling, slobbering psychopath would hit his intimate partner. It only is going to happen in these crazy, extreme relationships, and if that's so, then it's totally irrelevant to most of our experience. So we don't have to talk about it. But that changed in the late part of the 20th century, around the 1980s. And this study by Strauss and his colleagues in 1980 was one of the first studies that started to break this open. And Strauss simply did a national survey, a random representative sample of 2,100 adults, but 2,100 regularly sampled adults. So they didn't sample from prisons. He didn't sample from mental wards. He sampled regular adults. And he gave them an instrument called the Conflict Tactics Survey, abbreviated to the CTS. And this survey starts like this. It says, in relationships, people occasionally have arguments, and sometimes those arguments get heated. Here's a list of behaviors that sometimes couples exchange when they're having an argument. And I'd like to ask you to indicate which of these behaviors you personally have engaged in the last 6 months or so. And the behaviors are structured in a kind of interesting way. The first behavior is talked it out calmly. And the next one is, I forgot the next one, it's like, talked about it with heated voices. And each behavior is ranked, so it gets a little more extreme as you go down the list. After the first three, which are kind of all calm, nice things to do, you start getting to a set of behaviors that are classified as psychological aggression. Things like, I walked out, I sulked, I cried, I got angry at my partner. Those kind of psychological things. So then after 9 items of this conflict tactics survey, the first 3 of which are all kind of nice communications, the next 6 or 7 of which are psychological hostile conflict things that we were talking about last time, then it gets to the first physical behavior, like throwing something at my partner. And the next one, I have a list of them in a moment, and it gets more and more extreme. The next one is like, I slapped my partner, I hit my partner with a fist, I attacked my partner, I attacked my partner with a knife or a weapon, I beat up my partner. So by the time you get to the bottom, it's not like you get different answers than if you had just said from the very beginning, when's the last time you beat up your partner? You sort of built up to it. And Strauss wanted to know, well, how many people will admit, when you ask them about their own behavior, how many people will admit, yeah, I've hit my partner. I've hit my intimate partner. And the answer shocked a lot of people. 12% of husbands admitted to engaging in some kind of physical act. That means 12% of husbands said to some kind of physical behavior, or from the weakest to the most extreme, he just lumped them all together and found that 1 in 10, over 1 in 10 in the United States, well, that was astounding. I mean, something that accounts for, I'm thinking about how many people in this room. 1 in 10, that's not a rare or extreme behavior. That's something that's a major part of people's lives, if 1 in 10 people are engaging in it. And that has to be an underestimate. Because you're asking people to tell you on the phone, yeah, I hit my wife. Sure, I slapped her. Hit my wife. Well, most people, even who have done it, aren't going to tell a stranger on the phone, so that's got to be an underestimate. And people said, wow. And that was the beginning of an acknowledgement that IPV, intimate partner violence, is far from rare. It's not an extreme behavior. It's something that a lot of people are dealing with. And as it became more comfortable to talk about, as people accepted it, more people came out and said, oh, yeah. And we're able to say intimate partner violence is a part of a lot of people's lives. It's not rare, clearly. Myth number 2. Well, if it's not rare, the myth says, at least it's something that only the least happy people, only distressed relationships engage in. Okay, a lot of couples are violent with each other, or physically aggressive with each other. But you might argue, but those are going to be the really unhappy couples, right? I mean, those are going to be the absolute distressed, worst of the worst couples. And I'd like to believe that. But it doesn't seem to be true. And the data are pretty shocking. I study newlyweds. That's what I study. I collect samples of newlywed couples. And let me tell you something about newlywed couples, if I haven't told you before, they're happy, happy, happy. They're deeply in love, for the most part. And when I ask these deeply in love couples to fill out the CTS, the Conflict Tactics Survey that Strauss and his colleagues developed, 50% indicate engaging in some kind of physical aggression. 50% of newlyweds. Now, some of my newlyweds are unhappy, like 2%. But the other 48% are saying, I'm happy, I'm in love, and yeah, we've engaged in physical violence. O'Leary in 1992 shocked a lot of people by showing that high rates of violence in premarital couples who then went on to get married. So this is interesting, because my guess is that nobody's fantasy is to marry someone with whom they have physical fights. Male or female, nobody said, you know what I want to do? I want to marry someone who hits me. It just isn't part of anyone's dreams. For good reason. And yet, O'Leary took a sample of couples who were engaged, and he asked them to fill out the CTS, the Conflict Tactics Survey. And he found high rates of these engaged couples saying, yeah, we have recently engaged in physical violence when having a fight. And then he followed them over time and found that most of those couples got married. They were engaged, and they still got married even though they were engaging in physical violence. Well, that means something's going on here. Something mysterious is going on here. Because if you aren't, and it's, it may be mysterious to you or not, depending on your own experience with intimate partner violence. And I'm not assuming that this room is somehow immune from that experience. The myth is the idea being that you can say, yes, we have fought, and then on the next page say, and I am very happy with this person. The question is, how can that be? How can that be? Well, what kind of fighting are we talking about here? One of the reactions to this work was, you know what, there's a problem with the question. there's a problem with the CTS. And let me tell you, the conflict tactics survey is one of the most hated measures in all of family research. Because what are the ways you can criticize the measure? Many ways. One way is you've only asked people about what behaviors they've engaged in. You haven't asked people about the impact of those behaviors. You haven't asked those people to talk about, like, well, what, did you get bruised? Were you hospitalized? Or were you just sort of slapping each other around? You've watched the television show Seinfeld. Yes? No? Seinfeld? Seinfeld, Jerry Seinfeld and George and the other guy. On the show Seinfeld, which character is most likely to engage in physical violence against the other characters? That would be Elaine, Luke. Exactly right. Elaine, the female character. And what kind of violence? So Jerry's like, oh, I have something to say. And she's like, get out, push. And she pushes. And then you ask on the CTS, when's the last time you pushed your spouse? Well, yesterday. But that doesn't mean that Jerry's going to the hospital. On the other hand, if Jerry pushed Elaine, which he doesn't do very often, there'd be a different impact. So there's been a lot of criticism of the CTS. The other thing is, if you group together all the people who report any physical violence at all, you're grouping together people who say, yeah, I beat up my spouse, versus people who say, yeah, I pushed my spouse. And those might be different things. Let's take a look at what this data tends to look like. So now this is from some data that was collected in Tom Bradbury's lab, that I collected for Tom back when I was a graduate student many years ago. So these are the physical violence items on the CTS that I was telling you about. So you can see how they're ranked. Through something, that counts. Through something, even if I didn't throw it at you, it counts. Why? Because it's saying that I'm capable of doing violence to you. It's a very physically threatening act. If I take a plate and I throw it on the ground, well, I could have thrown it at you. So it counts as a physically aggressive act. Now we get to push, grab, and shove. Then slap, a little bit more extreme. Kick, bite, and hit is more extreme. Hit or tried to hit. Not sure what the difference is between this hit and that hit. Beat up spouse. Threatened with a knife or a gun. And use a knife or a gun. Well, you can see that this stuff here is very extreme and quite rare in the happy newlyweds that we're studying. It's not that it never happens, even in the happy newlyweds, but it's rare. Yes, what's your name? Melissa. No, this is self-report of what you personally did. Yep, I know what you're noticing there, Melissa. I noticed what you're noticing too. We'll get there in the very next slide. Okay, but we'll get to that point that you're all thinking about. The point is this: obviously, the moderate aggression, and Strauss actually classified these aggressive acts as moderate. He called these things through something, push, grab, or shove, or slapping, he called moderate aggression. Everything above that, he called severe aggression. Well, there's a lot more moderate aggression than severe aggression. Yes, there is. But there's a lot of severe aggression. And something you'll notice that maybe, well, what did you notice, Melissa? What's surprising you about this slide? It seems from this slide that the wives are more violent than their husbands. And indeed, that's the next myth. The myth is, well, only men are violent. Now, if you look at the CTS, which is A, the most hated measure in family violence literature, and B, the most used measure in family violence literature. So remember Strauss? Remember his study that showed that 12.1% of husbands report being violent in the last 6 months? 11.6% of wives in that study reported being violent as well. For a while, this was something you could not talk about in scholarly circles. You couldn't talk about it because everyone would jump on you and say, hey, wait a minute, are you saying that women and men are victims too? That it's equal? And that's not what I'm saying, and I don't think that's what anyone's saying. What they are saying is simply that there's a phenomenon here that has to be explained, which is that wives usually score higher on self-report scales of intimate partner violence. And here's 3 studies, each of which show that when you're asking how much did you do, self-reports, wives report more than husbands in all of those studies. Okay, Melissa. All right, well, let's talk about it. Why is this? And Melissa says one reason why is that women are more honest. There's less of a stigma. If a woman says, yeah, I slapped my husband, well, how bad is that? I mean, how much stigma is associated with someone saying, I had to slap him. He was angry. He made me angry and I slapped him. Versus a man saying, yeah, I slapped my wife. It sounds different. It has a different implication. There's a whole range of connotations that are different for when men or women are doing the same thing. So there may well be differences in reporting bias. I don't think that's the only answer. Melissa, what else you got? Yeah? Just last night. Well, that sounds like a very fun group of girls. Let us pull back from the issue of deserved it. But Melissa is saying something very, very interesting, is that in her not select group of girls, or young women, they were very happy to admit to slapping a guy. They were less likely to admit to being slapped. And in that group, slapping a guy felt justified. They could all look at each other and say, yeah, sometimes you got to slap a guy. But it never felt justified to be slapped by a guy. So there's a totally different culture around violence from men to women and violence from women to men. And what's the culture? Well, it's of course, and I want to get to that. I'll get to the other hands. But it makes sense that it's different because of the question of impact. Even if men and women are reporting the exact same behaviors, we know from the slide I showed you at the very first slide today that the impact differs on men and on women, as it should. Men tend to be bigger, men tend to be stronger. When men hit women, women break. And that's not a good thing. So the problem, one of the reasons people hate the CTS is that it doesn't ask about the impact of the behaviors. And it just asks about the behavior themselves. And some people say, that is wrong, that's misleading, because it suggests that men and women are doing the same thing, or women are doing it more, when really there's a whole different impact when the violence is against women from men, and that measure doesn't address that at all. A couple other people had comments. I'd like to get to them. Was there a comment over here? Megan? Maybe women feel more regret. Interesting. It's possible. These days I don't really get at regret, but it's possible. What's your name? Maya. Interesting. So what everyone in this column is trying to explain this behavior as some kind of a reporting bias. Either women have different definitions, so they're more likely to report, or women are more honest because there's less stigma associated, or maybe Megan suggests women have more regrets, so they're like confessing in a way. Is it Jordan? That's interesting. Women now, it's tough to unpack that, Jordan. So Jordan's saying maybe women are more threatened, and so they have to resort to violence. That's a tough one to wrap my head around, because you'd think that if you feel threatened and you instigate violence, you're opening yourself up for retaliatory violence that would make you even more of a victim. David? That's interesting. So David says, David's first point is, maybe women are more invested in relationships, so they get angrier. And the second point is, I think it relates to what Melissa was showing, is that, or telling us about, David says, women know that their moderate aggressive behavior, like slapping or pushing, isn't going to hurt the guy. So there's less stigma against doing it. Just like, again, we can watch Seinfeld and see Elaine pushing people over and whatever, punch him on the arm. And nobody's thinking that she's some kind of brute. But nobody punches Elaine. At least I didn't see that episode. Marianne. Well, it's interesting. This study was entirely self-report. Tell me what you personally have done. In my research, and which is this study, this study comes from data I've collected, we asked people, how often do you do this? How often did your partner do this to you? And what we get there, by the way, is evidence of an underreporting effect for males. Evidence of an underreporting effect for males. So we've seen evidence that when you ask both people in a couple, women say, yeah, he did it, much more than men say, I did it. There's another issue that didn't come up that I want to point out, which is if you've been hit, and let's say you're a woman and you've been hit, or let's say you're a woman and you're physically threatened, there may be a motivation to fight back. In other words, you might hit in retaliation for being hit. So you would expect, if that were true, a high correlation between the amount of violence that the male reports in a couple and the amount of violence that a female reports in a couple, and that is indeed the case. That within a couple, the amount of violence that the man says he engages in, and that the woman says she engages in, is highly correlated. Why? Because they're engaging at the same time. They're fighting with each other. But again, when men and women fight, the impact is not equivalent. It's women who are showing up at the hospitals. It's women who are being killed at much higher rates. What's your name? Liz. Your guess is as good as mine. Look, that's the question. How often did you do that? It's totally different. I'm not defending this measure. This measure sucks. But it is also the standard in the field, and I've used it myself. And so people ask the same question. What does it mean hit or try to hit? What does it mean slapped? Push, grab, or shove? Is that in the lane like get out of here? Or what? Threw something? What, a stuffed animal? A pillow? Or your collection of China dolls? It makes a big difference. And we don't know. We don't know enough. But what we do know is disturbing, or at least suggestive. But it's hard to interpret. The point being that intimate partner violence is something that men and women are both engaging in. It seems to be something dyadic. It's relational, at least according to these studies. Fourth myth is that, this has got to be something that happens in married couples. Because if you weren't married, you wouldn't put up with it. If you didn't have to, you wouldn't stick around. So any couple where there was violence and there's not marriage, that would be the end of that couple. Couple would end. Now, we've already seen that's not true. Because I've already shown you data, or I've told you about research showing that engaged couples who are not married, who are violent, still go on to get married. So clearly this is not a problem of just married couples. In fact, IPV is the highest in cohabiting couples. There's been research that has compared cohabiting couples to married couples, to dating couples that are not living together, and found cohabiting couples have the highest rates of violence, then married couples, then dating couples. Intimate partner violence is a problem in adolescent couples. It's a problem in high school. It's a tremendous problem in same-sex couples. Same-sex couples who have intimate partner violence levels comparable to cohabiting couples. Maybe if we allowed same-sex marriage, their rates would be reduced. Why do you think this is true? Why is intimate partner violence higher in cohabiting couples than married couples? I don't have an answer to that, by the way, but I'd like to know. Any thoughts? Why would it be? Luke?
Something along the lines of what you were saying before about investment,
Mm-hmm.
and that maybe there's less of a sense of trust or sort of feeling that there's an investment, so things like tempers are more likely to flare up.
That's interesting. So Luke suggests if we're living together, we can get in each other's face a lot, but we're not married. So, I can't trust you necessarily because I don't have the bonds of marriage keeping us together. And then maybe that's a fertile ground for losing control. Melissa, you're going to add something? Oh, that's interesting. So Melissa suggests the cohabiting couples who are violent are less likely to get married, one would hope, and so that's why the married couples have lower rates. Although, so 50% of married couples did cohabit before marriage, and that might account for it. It's an interesting idea. What's your name? Hugo?
Yeah. Married couples might have more to lose in terms of financial investments.
That's interesting. Hugo says if we're married, we're more interdependent. We share, maybe we're more likely to share a bank account, more likely to maybe have children. We have more investment in each other. So I'm less likely to, I want to protect you more. I'm less likely to hit you. Who's that back there? Lawrence. Hi, Lawrence. What's up? Might be children present? You'd like to believe, Lawrence, that the presence of children would reduce intimate partner violence. I'm not sure that's true, but I'd like it to be true. I don't have any data on that. Other thoughts? What's your name? Vicky. That's a great idea. Maybe these are just different people. Cohabiting couples are less likely to be very religious, more non-traditional, and so maybe that's associated with a willingness to strike in anger. All possibilities. All possibilities. But the point is, this isn't an issue of married people. It isn't an issue of people who sort of, have no choice. They have to stick it out. There are people who could leave. They're just dating, for goodness sakes. They're just kids, for goodness sakes. They're just in college, for goodness sakes. But it's still happening. It's happening in all those groups. That's how prevalent physical violence between intimates is. So there was all this data. So after Strauss, developed the CTS and started doing all this research, tons of studies came out looking at normal, not normal, but selected from the general population and seeing tons of violence, and a lot of research described that violence, and it was described in these terms, saying that couples are doing it together, high rates in women, it was happening all the time. And then there was some controversy. The controversy was that this picture of intimate partner violence is pretty prevalent, pretty mutual, and unrelated to relationship satisfaction. Some people came forward and said, I just do not believe that. And the people that came forward were people that worked for battered women's shelters. And those people said, wait, stop it! This is a dangerous story, and it's wrong. They took a look. These are people on the ground. These are people who are working in shelters for battered women. Battered women. Not women that have been pushed. Not women that have been slapped, but women that have been assaulted and battered. And they're saying, we are not recognizing the story that you're telling. The women in our shelters, it does seem uncommon, but it's not mutual. These women are victims, and they're very unhappy. This isn't some mutual thing. The women in our shelters are not women who, their husband got really mad, they fight, they slap each other when they're angry. These are women that have been terrorized by the men in their lives, who are suffering from PTSD or who are afraid for their lives. That's not what you're talking about. These aren't, and if you try to equate the two, you're doing a disservice. Well, and then the people like Strauss and people who've been using the CTS came back and said, well, all I'm doing is reporting the data. Just reporting the data. Just telling you what the facts are. And those two groups fought a lot. The advocates on the ground, the people who are actually working with really victims of real serious violence, and the people who are doing research in the general population, and they were like this. And that the field was like that for a while until one guy comes in and says, wait a minute, I've got the solution, and it's pretty simple. The guy that solved it was Michael P. Johnson. I love Michael P. Johnson. I remember him giving a talk on this in like 1994, and it was one of those talks that your jaw is like, oh yeah, you solved it, thank you. And what he said was, look, oh, you can't read this. This doesn't come out very well in red. There are two quite different types of intimate partner violence. There are two totally different types of intimate partner violence. Now, Michael P. Johnson, sociologist, was interested in intimate partner violence. He had read all the literature, and then he went and worked in a shelter for battered women. And he learned firsthand, wait a minute, what I'm reading about in my sociological literature does not relate to these women's lives. Why is it? Why is that? And he said, well, because the women in the shelters are women who have escaped awful situations. They don't participate in general social survey research. These women who are controlled and assaulted by their partners, when they pick up the phone, hi there, I'm doing some research on family life. Would you like to answer a few questions? They don't get to say, sure, I'd love to answer some questions. They're scared. The people who are answering questions are people who are fairly happy with their relationships, but they're a different group. They don't show up in battered women's shelters. So he said there are two types of intimate partner violence, and we've been studying them separately and pretending they're one thing. And he gave them names. He gave them names. And the first type, the type we've been talking about so far, he called common couple violence. Now, this word common can be misinterpreted. Common doesn't mean okay. Common doesn't mean natural. It doesn't mean right. It just means prevalent. It means frequently seen. And he said, look, common couple violence is what you measure on surveys. Common couple violence is when couples who are deeply involved with each other manage their anger poorly. Common couple violence is what you see involves arguing, it's mutual, it's reactive, it's emotional. It's we've been mad, I'm getting madder, and slap. That's common couple violence. He said, this is the kind of violence that we're likely to see on surveys, and that the CTS, that terrible measure, is likely to be measuring. The kind of violence that people engage in at the end of a fight when they're at wit's end, when they're frustrated. And again, he said, look, I'm calling it common because it is common, but that doesn't mean it's not dangerous. This can be fatal to women. This happens. Where a man will say, I lost control, and I threw her down the stairs. I lost control, and I shot her. But it's a loss of control after we were having a big, terrible fight. Common couple violence, by the way, is highly associated with substance abuse, as you might imagine. Because anything that is associated with losing control, that affects your ability to control your behavior, is going to affect common couple violence, because common couple violence is about a loss of control. It's reactive and emotional. It's what we've been talking about. So if this is what we're talking about, you're like, yeah, of course. It's mutual. The couple's fighting together. Yeah, women can get frustrated and fight too, just like men. In fact, more often because they're less nervous about the impact of their behavior. But, said Michael Johnson, the people who experience this are unlikely to be the people who show up in battered women's shelters. The profile of the woman that shows up in a battered women's shelter is totally different. And the batterer, the man who is battering that woman, is totally different. The circumstances of the violence are different. And he called that intimate terrorism. And he chose his words carefully. He called it terrorism because he said the purpose of this violence is to inflict terror. Intimate terrorism rates are measured by police and crime records. So, for example, I shared with you statistics at the front of the class saying between 1 and 4 million people each year are victims of violence, of assault. Well, that is from police records. That's intimate terrorism. Common couple violence is much, much more common. Think of if it's 1 in 10 and the country has, whatever, hundreds of millions of people, well, then it's tens of millions of people that are engaging in common couple violence, much fewer that are experiencing intimate terrorism. This is rarer. Rarer. But he said this motivated by a desire to control the partner. Intimate terrorism isn't about we had a fight and it escalated and then we got mad. Intimate terrorism is strategic. It's proactive. The intimate terrorist, the man who is a batterer, says, I know what I'm doing and I'm planning it out. It involves physical abuse and emotional abuse. The profile of the battered woman is that, well, let's talk about it. Battered women's shelters describe this, not that. And they describe this using something called, like, I don't actually know what it's called. If someone knows, raise their hand. I haven't gotten there yet. I'll get to that. I'll talk about intimate terrorism in a moment. But with this distinction in mind, let's talk a little bit more about common couple violence, which turns out to be what we've been talking about so far. Okay? Once we recognize that there's a kind of violence that emerges from a loss of control, it makes some sense that many distressed partners do not view their aggression as a major problem. Why? Because they have other problems. And they don't see the aggression per se as a problem. Now, if you're not in an aggressive relationship, if you've never in your life experienced intimate partner violence, and I hope you never do, you might say to yourself, oh, if my partner lifted a finger at me, that'd be the end. And I hope that you never have to face that. But if you experience it, it doesn't come in a vacuum. So wives seeking marital therapy were asked, what was your most important problem? Why are you seeking marital therapy? 6% of wives seeking marital therapy say that violence is why I'm getting this therapy. But 56% of those same wives say there's violence in the relationship. So now there are wives who are seeking therapy. They're actually saying, this relationship is in trouble and I need help. Oh, really? What's the problem? What's the problem? Well, we've got a problem. And even though this is a violent relationship or it's got aggression in it, very few say that's the problem. Well, what's going on? How can this be? What's going on is that if the aggression is infrequent, if the aggression always happens at the end of a fight, you think, well, the problem is that we were fighting. The aggression, well, you might say, if you're the victim of it, well, he lost control. We've got to figure out a way to not have those fights. If the aggression happens always in the context of substance abuse, you might say, the problem is substance abuse. The problem is he drinks too much. If the aggression happens in the context of a loss of control, the problem might be a loss of control and not the aggression itself. And that might be why it's possible to say, hey, I'm a newlywed, I'm happy. Yeah, we got to work on that loss of control stuff, yes. But we still have generally a good relationship. Indeed, that seems to be what we're seeing in some of our newlyweds, in some of these studies of engaged couples. Couples who are able to say, look, we've got some problems, like poor communication. We've got to work on our communication, yes. But we'll do it. We'll work on it. So here's the question. Are they right? Those happy newlyweds who are violent, are they right that it's not a big deal? What happens to those violent newlyweds? What happens to newlyweds who are violent? Well, I'll tell you what happens. They get divorced. Violence is an enormous predictor of divorce in newlyweds. So if you're newlyweds and you're experiencing violence, it's a big predictor of divorce. But guess what? If you divide up the violent people into moderately aggressive, the yellow line, and severely aggressive, the green line, and compare them to the non-aggressive couples, this is a survival curve. So this is your chance of still being married this many months into marriage. Okay, this is from our own data. So, as newlyweds, everyone's married, 100%. We start with marriage. And then the non-aggressive, the red line, as time goes on, there are more and more, some of them divorced, some of them divorced, and their chances of still being married 4 years later is 62% in this particular sample. The people who were moderately aggressive, so that's the people who were slapping and punching and a little throwing something. And as Liz points out, I don't know where the slap was. I don't know what they were throwing. But that moderate aggression, they look very similar, 54% survival rate. It's the severely aggressive people who are also happy who don't survive. It's very hard to survive for long. It's possible to be happy in the moment, but that doesn't last. It's fragile. The happiness of people who are experiencing violence is a fragile happiness. Yep. It's the CTS again, I'm sorry to say. It's what we've got. So moderate violence are people who admit to doing these top 3 things. Severe violence are people who admit to doing any of these things. That's the difference. Everyone in this study is common couple violence. This is all common couple violence. These are all newlyweds on the CTS. None of these are battered women. These are couples who participate in marital research. The couples who say, yeah, I'll be in your marital study, those aren't battered women. That's common couple violence. So this is all common couple violence. My point of this slide is common couple violence has consequences. Common couple violence predicts divorce. It really predicts divorce if it's severe. That is my point. Intimate terrorism is something else. Let's talk a little about intimate terrorism. It's been defined as a systematic and sustained effort to control and dominate a partner through physical violence and verbal and psychological abuse and sexual coercion and abuse and economic and social control and threats of same. Common couple violence is you had a fight, it escalates, and now you're fighting physically. A verbal fight becomes a physical fight. Intimate terrorism is not about anger, it's about control. And if it's about control, there's many ways to control and dominate a human being. And in the pattern for battered women is that the battering is part of a constellation of controlling behaviors on the part of the batterer. And now we get to a diagram that battered women's shelters use to illustrate this point. It looks like this. Has anyone seen this before? Raise your hand if you've seen this before. All right. No one has. Well, this is developed by a woman named, I think, Walker, who works with battered women. And the idea is to say that in the pattern of a battered woman, in the profile of a battered woman, there is a constellation of behaviors which are all centered on power and control for the batterer. The batterer needs to dominate the victim and does so through a number of different behaviors. Let's go through them. So there's physical abuse is considered the rim of the wheel because it makes all the rest possible. The batterer uses not just physical abuse, but the threat of physical abuse to surround the victim. And so this is all using a weapon, physical abuse, punching, kicking, grabbing, punching hair, shoving, hitting, pushing. The outside of physical abuse and the threat of this physical abuse is what allows the batterer to also exert power and control in all of these different other ways. Threatening children, sexual abuse, economic abuse. Economic abuse basically like making sure that you don't have a job, taking your money, controlling the bank account, cutting up your credit cards. That means that I control what you have and what you can spend money on. Emotional abuse, making you feel bad about yourself. I control you if you think that you can't make it without me. The more I can convince you that you are dependent on me, the more I control you. Isolation, controlling who you see, who you talk to, who you email, who you text. looking through your phone records to make sure that you don't get support from anybody else. Because the more you have no support from anyone else, the more I control you. And how can I do this? How can I do that? The physical violence surrounds and makes it all happen. The threat of physical violence allows me to do that. Intimidation. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. If you try to leave this relationship, I will kill our kids. You think, wow, that's extreme behavior. Unless you read the newspaper, I don't know about you, but as I was gearing up to give this lecture, every single day, it seems, another person has killed his wife and kids and himself. Have you noticed that? It's just crazy. It's every day in the newspaper, it's always a man, has killed his family. And typically it says, oh, well, you know, he was suffering some financial problems. That's a problem. But this is a guy who so couldn't imagine, these are men who so can't imagine not controlling every aspect of their family life that he figures if I can't control these people, I'd rather they'll all be dead. The need to control, making threats. This is not common couple violence. And this isn't behavior out of anger. It's not that someone says, I'm so mad at you, I'm going to cut up your credit cards. No, that's a quiet thing. That's a strategic thing, which is, I'm thinking about this now. I'm thinking about this now, and I'm thinking that the best way for me to protect you from yourself is to make sure you don't talk to anyone but me, that nobody comes to the house, and that you can't spend money on anything unless I tell you. Now, if you're writing a movie, intimate terrorist is your villain, and all the movies that you've seen about battered women are about intimate terrorism, because these guys make great villains because they're terrible, terrible people. And so the movies that you've seen, there was a movie with Jennifer Lopez called Enough. It was about intimate terrorism. Though Julia Roberts was in one, Sleeping with the Enemy. I didn't see it, but my understanding is that the enemy was an intimate terrorist. And so she actually faked her own death, I believe. And then, you know, he discovered that she was alive, and they had to do the whole fatal attraction thing at the end. What are the consequences of intimate terrorism? Well, it's not rocket science. If you find yourself trapped in a house with a person who's capable of physically threatening you, who is physically threatening you and capable of enacting a physical harm, and does it, so even when that person isn't physically threatening you, that person is, you know that person can and would do it, well, obviously, the physical injuries are severe, but so are the psychological problems. Exposure to an intimate terrorist is, of course, psychologically damaging. You know, we talked about attachment styles, right? Secure attachment versus insecure attachment. And we may have talked about how their attachment styles are pretty stable. They're pretty stable throughout your life. It would take an extreme event to change your model of what intimacy is like. Well, this is that extreme event. Battered women show signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, and who wouldn't? Of course, they're isolated on purpose. They have economic difficulties because they've been prevented from developing the economic skills of getting by. Children in this environment, of course, are traumatized, and of course, this is more likely to be the men who end up killing their wives. So how does it happen? You know, how does it actually go? How does anyone put up with it? Why would anyone stay 1 minute after the first assault? Why not just escape? What's the psychology of it? Because as we know, a lot of women who are battered, many return to the batterer. And I think that the latest story in the news, I mean, every year, it's very easy to find new stories. But the latest story of something like this is that woman, singer, what's her name? Rihanna. Now, I haven't followed it closely, because I don't have any idea who she is. But my understanding is she's a singer, and she is in a relationship with another singer. Am I right? And she was battered by the male singer. Please, if someone wants to tell the story that knows more details than me? The point, yes, Heidi?
Basically what happens is he was getting calls from his ex-girlfriend all night, and Rihanna had noticed before all that happened, Chris was notorious for pushing her. And she would slap him in the face or in the arm when he would push her, but he never did it. And he also was found on a battered woman. And he said in an interview with Tyra Banks at one time that he would never hit a woman. In the beginning of his career. And I know a lot about hetero people, if you're wondering. I don't just like gay people. Anyway, so the night of everything, they had had an argument before they went to the party. He had been receiving calls and calls from his ex-girlfriend to make her jealous. She got jealous. She pushed him. He pushed her. People saw it. They decided to leave the party together in the car. He decided to speed down the street dangerously. She tried to grab the wheel. He pulled over to a gas station. His credit card didn't work. Now he's more agitated. Does he leave? The pump was like
Gas thing?
the gas thing's still on the ground. He speeds off. She eventually makes him pull over, grabs the keys, throws the keys out the window, and he decides to start really on he takes his backhand first.
Okay, that's enough details. What's that an example of? What's that example of? Common couple violence. Textbook common couple violence. And it's a great example for the class because it's extreme. It's very bad. It's very dangerous. But it's not intimate partner terrorism. Heidi. Beg to differ, please.
He was notorious for controlling her at parties. She would have a discussion with someone about work, and he thought that she was sleeping with that person.
Ah, interesting.
Made her less sociable at parties. If he wasn't there, she was very sociable, got a lot of work done. If he was there, she didn't really talk that much.
Very interesting. So Heidi says, I respectfully beg to differ, and she points out that he was quite controlling, actually. Controlling her, tried to isolate her socially, which is consistent with intimate partner terrorism. Very interesting. So, and by the way, I wouldn't expect that the line between common couple violence and intimate terrorism is, some black and white huge divide. There's going to be some overlap. In any case, what's this? The same woman, Walker, who developed that circle to describe the battered woman and the battered cycle that keeps it alive, described the cycle of violence in battering relationships, and that captures some of the psychology of these relationships that gives us a little bit of insight into how they can last. Again, you want to talk about. Let's just go through her cycle. She says what happens first is a stage she calls tension building. And that's when the male hostility escalates in the form of angry outbursts. So this is a period in the relationship where the man's saying, like, hey, you're getting on my nerves, and where threats escalate. Angry outbursts are not the same thing as the tension building stage lasts over the course of like days. We're not talking about tension building like we're having an argument that's getting more and more tense. We're saying that over the course of several days, the man is just getting more hostile, being more threatening, saying, hey, watch what your behavior, watch what you're doing, and a tension rises in the relationship. And of course, if this is a relationship that's already been violent, the woman says, well, there's a threat. Violence might be coming, and I'm nervous about that. So I better watch myself. Because it's possible I can avoid the violence. Maybe I can avoid the violence. But the tension is unleashed during the battering stage. The man, there's a spark, there's something, and finally he lets loose. He says, I'm going to make good on my threat, and there's severe violence and battering. In this case, in the case of Chris Brown, it happened in a car. But what Walker says is crucial about the cycle of violence is the contrition phase. This is crucial. Is that the man apologizes. Says, I'm sorry, I promise to change. And tries to convince the woman and anybody else involved, let's say Tyra Banks, that severe abuse will never happen again. Oh, I'm sorry, baby, it will never happen again, I promise. Now, let's say you're the victim of abuse. How motivated are you to believe that promise. I submit to you, you are highly motivated to believe that promise. If you're the victim of intimate partner terrorism, and you have been socially isolated, and you've been threatened, and you have a guy who you know is very out of control, and is willing to commit terrible acts against you and your loved ones and your pets and your children, and that person says, I promise I will never do it again, I submit to you that you are highly motivated to believe that promise. You want it to be true. And indeed, a temporary calm is restored. Hey, maybe it's really great. Suddenly, you're having great sex, like, oh, this is the man I fell in love with. Yay! This is the man I want back. Reward. You are rewarded for forgiving him. The problem is that this is about control. And the batterer's need for control is impossible to assuage. You can't fill that hole. It's bottomless. So the cycle begins again. More tension. He'll see something that he realizes, wait a minute, I don't control you completely, because you can't control someone completely. The tension building stage builds again, and you're into the next cycle. And this is not an uncommon description of the cycle of violence in battered situations. You see the psychology. The psychology is there's a threat that keeps you there during the tension stage. You're thinking, no, maybe this time it will be different. I want it to be different, but then it isn't different. And it's this apology phase that keeps the cycle alive. So why do women stay? You know, if you're not battered, it's a tough question to answer. You know, if you've never experienced this, and I hope you never do, I hope we can all remain on the outside of this. But if we are on the outside of it, you can look and say, what's going on? Why don't you just get out of there, girl? The old idea, back before the 1980s, was that women in battering relationships were masochists, were self-hating people who you know, liked to be punished or found it rewarding. That was the old idea. That the victims, were somehow sick in the head. Nobody believes that anymore. At least nobody reputable believes that anymore. Now, research on these kind of relationships, on battered women, draws a lot from social exchange theory. And we talked about social exchange theory, right? We talked about how you can be dependent on a relationship even if it's not a good relationship. Why do women stay in battered relationships? A lot of these answers fall down upon, not all of them, but a lot of them can be summarized by dependence. Well, the whole point of the batterer is to make the woman dependent on the relationship, so it makes sense. Why do women say fear? It's easy to be afraid if he says, oh, by the way, if you ever try to leave me, I will kill you. And men do kill their partners. Just ask Nicole Brown Simpson, who was battered, who was a victim of abuse, finally got out, but didn't escape, obviously. Why do women stay? Financial dependence. Where am I going to go? I don't make any money. I have kids. I have mouths to feed. And I'm entirely dependent on him for income. Where am I going to go? If you have nowhere to go, and you have children, or you yourself like to eat, maybe you have to stay. Maybe you have to put up with the abuse. Social isolation is a big one. Again, that's part of that's why it's part of the arsenal of the batterer. Because social isolation makes you more dependent. You have nowhere to go. Where are you going to go? Your friends, you don't have any friends. Where are you going to go? Your family? Yeah, I've cut off ties with your family. So you can't leave. None of this requires you to like being battered. It just means you have nowhere else to go. Insufficient resource information. Well, you can go to a battered women's shelter only if you know where the battered women's shelter is. Only if you know that there is a battered women's shelter. And many battered women don't have access to that information. Well, why did she Google it? You know, there's an obvious answer. A lot of women are prevented from getting this information. There's such a thing as passivity and learned helplessness. If someone has told you over and over again, you're incompetent, maybe you believe it. Maybe you have been told you aren't worth it. No one else will ever love you but me. Even though I batter you, I really love you. I'm doing it for your own good. I'm doing it because I love you so much, baby. Well, that's a message that can be introjected. It can be absorbed. There is an element of self-blame. Not self-hatred, but self-blame. Again, if you hear the message, oh, I shouldn't have got him so mad, and next time I won't get him so mad. Next time I'll cook the toast exactly the way he likes. I shouldn't have overcooked it. Well, to the extent that you do blame yourself, that would operate against getting out. And of course, there are norms of gender and culture. What is a woman supposed to do in this culture? Take care of the family. Take care of her man. Stand by your man, says Patsy Cline. Well, if you're a battered woman, that message can be a harmful message. If you're really in a dangerous relationship with a dangerous man, that can be a harmful message, but it's still the message that women get. Which is that the worst thing you do, something that's antithetical to being a woman, is to leave your husband, even if he's a batterer. And this is the more puzzling one. There are women who will absolutely report, that man who battered me, I stay because I love him. I don't claim to understand that. But it is reported not seldom by battered women, that despite everything, I still love him. Which raises questions about what love is, what it's all about. Raises some questions, I think, that are possibly well answered by attachment theory, which says, well, it depends on what's your model of what love is. What's your model of what's expected by a lover? If your model is you expect your lover to care for you, it's going to be hard to love somebody who beats you. But if your model from childhood is that love is about caring for somebody else, well, a batterer needs you to be there. And maybe that fulfills you in some way. At least it's possible. Why do women stay? It's a complicated constellation of answers, and there's support for all of this. Perhaps as puzzling, why do men batter? Lots of reasons. It's also this is not a simple phenomenon. I'm not pretending to oversimplify it. Early childhood experiences is the obvious answer. So the sort of myth or the stereotype is the children of abuse grow up to be abusers. The evidence for that's pretty weak. There's some evidence. There's a significant relationship. The children of abusive parents, if you've been abused as a child, you are significantly more likely to grow up to be an abuser. Yes. But most people who are abusers do not report having been abused as children. So this is a contributing factor, but it's hardly the whole story. More issue is this desire to regain control, is that batterers have control issues, significant issues with control. I don't know where those issues come from, and that's something that's been discussed and studied. But the idea is that these are people for whom the ability to not be in control is just anathema to them. They cannot take it. And these are the men who are killing themselves and their family. When they're losing economic control in these bad economic times. And not only can they not survive a moment of life, but they can't bear the idea that their family will survive without them ruling the day. Traditional gender roles play a role. Batterers tend to be highly invested in traditional gender roles that say the man is the head of the household, the leader of the ship of the family. And when those roles are threatened, they're more likely to batter. Powerlessness actually sort of rides underneath all of this. People who need control are people who fundamentally feel powerless. And of course, the batterer fundamentally does feel powerless, and so finds a victim to exert power over. There are battering associated with real diagnosable personality disorders. There's battering associated, I've already said, with substance abuse. It's not on there, but it's totally true. Actually, no, excuse me. Substance abuse is much more associated with common couple violence, pardon me. And jealousy, I guess this was Chris Brown's issue. Doesn't solve the puzzle. Gives us a direction. Doesn't solve the puzzle. But before we go, let's say, so what are we going to do about it? What can we do about it? What can we do to help couples who are experiencing violence? We'd like to help them. Nobody in the world is arguing in favor of violence between intimates. It's bad. Violence between intimates is a bad thing. But helping them is going to be a complicated thing because one size does not fit all. And this was the problem that Michael Johnson was trying to address. Michael Johnson was trying to say, look, if you take advice geared towards and developed from research on common couple violence, and you apply it to intimate terrorism, you might be in trouble. Because what should we do for people who are experiencing common couple violence? Well, anger management might be a good idea. If there's violence that's coming out of angry episodes, let's say, let's talk about anger. Let's bring in the couple in couples therapy and offer them communication skills. Hey guys, there's a better way to deal with your anger than laying into each other. What are you angry about? Let's talk about your relationship. Maybe we can heal this relationship and make violence less a part of it. But imagine giving that advice to a real intimate terrorist relationship, to a battered woman. Go to your partner and suggest that you go together to therapy. That's an invitation for danger. There's been a lot of research on how to help battered women, and it all boils down to this: help the victim to escape. There is no other advice for battered women except help the victim to escape. So what do battered women's shelters do? Battered women's shelters try to offer women resources to help them get out. They don't try to fix the relationship. Common couple violence maybe can be fixed. I'm not aware of research showing that intimate terrorism can be fixed. Rather, battered women's shelters say, let's give you another source of economic independence. Let's give you a cell phone. Let's give you resources of places you can go to escape. Battered Women's Shelter says, here's somewhere you can go where the address is secret. Nobody knows where you are. Let's establish a new identity for you. Common couple violence you can fix with anger management. For intimate terrorism, help the victim to escape. That's as far as we've gone on that. Class dismissed.